Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for USDTL ToxTime. I'm your host, Grace Del Pena. Today's presenter is Dr. Joseph Jones, Chief Operating Officer with USDTL. He'll be discussing the detection of buprenorphine in hair. Please note this presentation is being recorded and we will be sharing this event with everyone that registered. Without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Joseph Jones.
Thank you, Grace. Welcome to this edition of ToxTime. My name is Joe Jones, Chief Operating Officer here at USDTL. Let's get started. Today, we're going to be talking about the detection of buprenorphine in hair. So what is buprenorphine? Buprenorphine is an opioid. It's a partial agonist. It's used to treat moderate to severe pain. But more importantly, for the purpose of this discussion, it's used for medication-assisted treatment, specifically for opioid use disorder. The FDA approved this for this purpose back in 2002, and the big advantage of this is that it can be used unsupervised, which means a person in recovery can have a prescription and they can take it home and take the medication at home, as opposed to methadone, which has to be administered while being supervised. Buprenorphine is metabolized to norbuprenorphine through N-dealkylation. And you can see in the red circle on the chart, you see that that unit is not appearing on the norbuprenorphine. And it has a really long half-life. This is what makes it a really good drug for medication-assisted therapy, is that when you take buprenorphine, it's long-acting and it does not eliminate very quickly, as opposed to the other opiates, which can have some pretty quick half-lives of just a couple of hours. Buprenorphine comes in several different preparations. It can come only as buprenorphine, or it can come combined with other drugs such as naloxone. It can be a tablet, it can be a sublingual, it can be something for your buccal cavity, which is the back of the side of your cheek. It can be an injection, it can be a skin patch, and now they've got this new implant where you inject the implant under your skin and it releases over time. Buprenorphine has a very long history of being a very effective medication for MAT. There was a study published just this year in drug and alcohol dependence, and I thought I would share these results with you because they're really interesting. And so the study was 2 rural counties in western Massachusetts, Franklin County and Hampshire County. You can see in the maps that one is on the north border, one is kind of in the middle, so they're right beside each other. In the Franklin County penal system, they offered buprenorphine treatment. It was one of the first counties to do so in the country. And Hampshire County, which is right next door, did not offer buprenorphine. And so what these researchers did was they started comparing the outcomes of the individuals as they exited the prison system. And to set this study up before we talk about the results, the participants in this study were all adults with opioid use disorder who exited the 2 jail systems between January of 2015 and April 2019. Altogether, there was 469 participants in this study. In Franklin County, there were 197, of which 93.4% of them accepted buprenorphine when it was offered to them as a treatment. And Hampshire County had 272 that exited, but none of these were offered or used buprenorphine. So with any prison system, the recidivism is a very important variable that they monitor and that they compare different strategies to try to improve recidivism. And so a couple of them that they monitored here was incarcerations and probation violations, and then overall recidivism. But we can see that in Franklin County, only 21.3% were reincarcerated within the first year, whereas over in Hampshire County, they had 39%. and that finding was statistically significant with a p-value of less than 0.001. The number of days to the first event was not statistically significant with the 0.13, but it was still as expected with 185 days to first event versus 159 days. So what this means is that the individuals who were in Franklin County and were receiving buprenorphine treatment, fewer of them were reincarcerated, and those that were reincarcerated, it took more days before that happened. So if you're a taxpayer in that particular area, this is a very important thing because you're paying for this. And so the longer that we can keep people out of the prison system, everybody wins. The prisoner, the family of the prisoner, and the community at large. Probation violations were also much better. As far as the number of probation violations, that was not statistically different, but what was statistically different was the days to the first event of probation violation. So in Franklin County, it was on average 229 days before there was a probation violation, whereas over in Hampshire County, it was 163 days. Any recidivism at all? Again, Franklin County had much better numbers. The percentage was 48% compared to 62% in Hampshire County, and that finding was statistically significant. They also took a look at the mortality, and out of the two counties, there was really no difference in the number or the percentage of prisoners who exited of dying. But the days that passed until these death episodes happened was interesting in the same direction. Again, not statistically significant with a p-value of 0.27, but nonetheless, it took on average 242 days for those that passed away to pass away compared to Hampshire County, which happened much quicker at 160 days. So again, this is a very, very good study that shows the power of the effectiveness of buprenorphine with two communities that are right beside each other. So of course, we're making a lot of assumptions here. There are going to be differences, but these two communities are side by side, and we got very different outcomes from Franklin County, who used buprenorphine, compared to Hampshire County, who did not use buprenorphine. One of the big advantages of buprenorphine being used for medication-assisted therapy is that there's a very low abuse potential for buprenorphine. Very few people really get the pleasurable high that you experience like with heroin or metham or cocaine. So to further this discussion, it's important that we are aligned on three specific terms that are going to be helpful going forward. And that is, what is abuse, misuse, and diversion. So abuse involves any intentional, non-therapeutic use of a drug, product, or substance, even once, for the purpose of achieving a desirable psychological or physiological effect. Misuse involves an intentional therapeutic use of a drug product in an inappropriate way, and specifically it excludes the behavior that meets the definition of abuse. Finally, diversion is any intentional act that results in transferring a drug product from lawful to unlawful distribution or possession. Now that we are aligned with these three important terms, abuse, misuse, and diversion, we can talk about this important paper that was published back in 2014, where they used the RADARS, or the Researched Abuse, Diversion, and Addiction-Related Surveillance System, to go out and see just how people responded to buprenorphine in the wild. And what they found is that only 3% of the people out there thought that it gave them a better high than another drug. Only 4% of the people called it their drug of choice. However, 63% of the people using buprenorphine used it for abstinence maintenance. 75% of them were non-prescribed in a pre-treatment scenario. So people know that buprenorphine works. They know that it will keep them from going through DTs or withdrawals. And so they know that if they can get their hands on buprenorphine, it can tide them over until they can get their drug of choice. And this brings us to what Chilcote and his associates called the Buprenorphine Conundrum. So buprenorphine is generally safe and efficacious, and there's a very limited abuse potential when it is used as prescribed. On the other hand, the abuse potential in the absence of opioid dependence is there, and we have to respect that. Infections related to injections. So if people crush it up and try to inject it, you can run into all sorts of trouble with the injectables. Overdose risk, especially with drug combinations such as benzodiazepines and alcohol. There's also an issue of accidental pediatric exposure, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And there's this reluctance of use by primary care physicians. They have to go through special certification, and they have to be aware of it. And just there's a lot of people that there's a lot of stigma associated with opioid dependence. And this shows up with reluctance of use by primary care physicians. One of the specific elements in the buprenorphine conundrum is this notion of accidental pediatric exposure. So what is that all about? So because buprenorphine works so well, the number of prescriptions tripled between 2008 and 2015. So what does that mean? That means that there's more homes with buprenorphine somewhere in the house. The preparations come as tablets and films, and often they're split. So they'll cut the pill in half, or they'll cut the film in half and take half of one of the units. The ceiling effect, which we talked about with the partial agonist and the lessening of the abuse potential, so that's really observed in adults, but it's not observed in children. And so these minute amounts can actually be dangerous to children. As an example, between 2008 and 2015, where I mentioned that the number of prescriptions tripled, we had 8,136 pediatric buprenorphine-specific emergency department visits. 75% of those were children ages 1 to 2 years old, and 61% of these children required hospitalization. So this is a serious issue that needs to be considered. So before we move into the hair-specific portion of this presentation, a little poll question, if you don't mind taking a second to answer it, yes or no. Have any of your clients inquired about testing for buprenorphine? If you don't mind answering that poll, I appreciate it, and we'll move forward with the presentation. So if we're going to talk about the detection of buprenorphine in hair, first let's go over exactly how our drug's incorporated in the hair. First and foremost is environmental exposure. If you're in a room with someone smoking the drug or handling the drug, or as we mentioned previously, cutting the pills and handling them, the buprenorphine will transfer from the environment to the outside of the hair. Once it is on the hair, it works its way into the nooks, crannies, and pores, binds to the proteins and pigments, and then is available to be harvested and analyzed. Route number 2 is the sweat and the oil from the scalp. Those fluids contain drug and drug metabolites similar to urine, and as they bathe the hair shaft, they deposit the drug and drug metabolite onto the hair. Again, it works its way into the nooks, crannies, and pores, binds to the proteins and pigments, and we start to see that show up a few hours after a dose. Not saying that it would be positive after a single dose in a couple of hours, but it starts to show up in a couple of hours. And last but not least, what most people think about with hair drug testing is the blood, which contains drug and drug metabolite. It's deposited into the hair root. As that portion of hair emerges past the scalp line, which takes about 2 weeks, then that hair can be harvested and analyzed. So at the end of the day, we've got 3 very different modes of incorporation. superimposed on top of each other. So it's overlapping and complex. So at the laboratory, we know that the hair grows at a 1/2 inch a month. So we identify the root end, we cut it at 1.5 inches, and that leaves us with a segment of hair that represents approximately 3 months of history. Now that we're familiar with what buprenorphine is and what buprenorphine is used for and how drugs are incorporated into hair, let's take a look at some of the literature. So one of the first papers that demonstrated the detection of buprenorphine in hair, I don't know if this is the very first paper, but it's certainly the oldest one that I've come across. Back in 1993, Dr. Pascal Kentz reported his findings from 3 daily users of buprenorphine over at the Institut de Médecine Légale in Paris. He used a different kind of detector than GCMS, and this was before LC-MS-MS was really feasible to look at the levels that we're looking at now on a very robust platform. So he was looking for alternatives to GCMS. And that's because in GCMS, the heat degrades buprenorphine. So he had a procedure that used a high pressure liquid chromatography unit with a coulometric detector, which is looking at the electrical potentials, electrochemistry, if you will. And so with that particular device back then, these 3 daily users of buprenorphine, he found 480 picograms per milligram up to 590 picograms per milligram of the buprenorphine, the drug itself, and he found between 60 and 150 of the metabolite norbuprenorphine. So fast forward a few years, Vincent and his team figured out a way to analyze buprenorphine without the decomposition. And so they looked at 5 long-term users that were in treatment, and they found between 60 and 361 of the parent buprenorphine in the hair, and they found between 29 and 785 of the metabolite norbuprenorphine. A more detailed study was published by Dr. Marilyn Hustis and her team back in 2007, working at the Center for Addiction and Pregnancy at Johns Hopkins. They followed 9 heroin-dependent pregnant women who were getting a range of dose of buprenorphine between 4 and 24 milligrams of buprenorphine per day. They collected hair specimens every 4 weeks, and this was a side project of a much bigger study, but this had some very, very interesting and useful results for mothers and for neonatal outcomes. So these are the results of one of those mothers, and this was like one of the typical responses that was published. And we can see that over time, as they take their daily buprenorphine dose, the cumulative dose increases, obviously, from 324 to 744 to 1302 to 1590 to 2454, and then the baby was born. And so as time went on, the cumulative dose increased. When they analyzed these hair specimens that were collected approximately 4 weeks apart, we can see how the norbuprenorphine specifically accumulated at much higher levels than the buprenorphine over time. And once the babies were born, they collected hair from 4 of the babies, which, if you think about it, about half of the babies are born without a lot of hair. So this is why we don't use hair for newborn toxicology. But we had the same pattern here with the newborn exposure to buprenorphine and the metabolite, in that the metabolite norbuprenorphine, shown here in blue, was way higher than the buprenorphine that was captured by the hair of the newborn. So now let's take a look at some trends of what we're seeing here at our laboratory. The first view I thought that we should share is the number of orders that we get each quarter for buprenorphine. So clearly buprenorphine is not part of the standard 5 panel. It's on a much larger panel. It's a lot more expensive to do. But over the past couple of years, we can see, with the exception of the dip during the middle of the COVID pandemic crisis, we can see that in general, our clients are seeing buprenorphine being a greater concern, in that the number of orders for buprenorphine testing is going up a little bit over time. Another trend that we see at our laboratory is that the positivity rate is going up slightly. Now, we see that these are very high positivity rates, between 11 and 19% compared to some other drugs, which might be 1 or 2%. But keep in mind that a lot of our patients that we're testing for buprenorphine, they are in buprenorphine treatment, so they're expected to be positive. But we do occasionally come across cases where individuals are trying to use buprenorphine to beat the urine test. So they know that their urine test for their program or their workplace is using a 5 or 10 or 12 panel, which buprenorphine is not part of. You collect the urine, you screen it for a 12 panel, it's negative, and they go to work or get their driver's license back or what have you. And so then a couple of days later, they can switch back to their drug of choice. With the hair, they've got to quit for 3 months. And so that's an advantage of hair. And it's something that we have to be aware of with buprenorphine is the misuse of buprenorphine. And when we do find buprenorphine, the metabolite is typically about 3 or 4 times higher than the parent drug buprenorphine. Looking at this chart where we're comparing the metabolite concentrations, norbuprenorphine, to the concentration of the parent drug buprenorphine, we see that there is a positive association. We would assume this with the slope of the line at 0.53, but that association is statistically very weak with a R squared of 0.11. What we're seeing is the effects of all of the different mechanisms of ingestion, and we're also seeing perhaps even some environmental exposure on some of these cases. And of course, you're going to have a lot of different responses to these two compounds due to like hair color and hygiene, cosmetic treatment. And I thought we would also take a look at when we find buprenorphine in hair, what also do we find? And so in our population that we test, which is generally a high-risk population, when we find buprenorphine in about half of the cases, buprenorphine is the only thing that we find. But in 17%, we also find some amphetamines, be it amphetamine, methamphetamine, or ecstasy. In 11% of the cases, we find buprenorphine and marijuana. And then it drops down to 3% for amphetamines, buprenorphine, and marijuana, 1.5% for amphetamine, cocaine, and buprenorphine, and then 1.5% for benzodiazepines with buprenorphine, 1% with barbiturates and buprenorphine, 1% with buprenorphine, cocaine, and marijuana, and then 1% with the amphetamine, tramadol, and buprenorphine. And so what this is telling me is that a lot of our people on buprenorphine, this is a very different chart than you saw last quarter with the fentanyl chart, where very few of the fentanyl results were fentanyl only. Here, half of them are buprenorphine only. So it's working for these individuals. And my assumption for some of these other co-exposures is just that they're probably going back home to an environment where they were before they went into treatment, and there's somebody else in the home using. So if we could remove all of those from this chart, those percentages might even be a little less. But that would be a deeper dive, and maybe we can look at that at some other time. So in conclusion, buprenorphine is a very effective treatment for opioid use disorder. Usage has increased significantly over the years, specifically because it has a low abuse potential. Unfortunately, there's also a high misuse potential as well as a high diversion potential. Additional concern is also there for pediatric exposure. So we've come to the end of our presentation here today. I thank you for your attention today, and I turn it back over.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, for that wonderful presentation. Before we get started with our Q&A, I'd like to take a moment to talk about USDTL newest offerings, electronic chain of custody forms. Many of our clients have been asking for it, and we listen. Not only is electronic chain of custody form environmentally friendly and help reduce paper waste, make it easier for you as the collector to enter orders and increase accuracy of the information entered. Rest assured, this site uses SSL protocol and communication follows HIPAA compliance for security purposes. As our client, you are most likely using our web portal to check your results. Now you can order your test from the same place. Having access to electronic chain of custody forms allows clients to manage order, reduce errors that may cause delays due to unreadable handwriting, and the electronic signature can be turned on when conducting collection out in the field. So no need to carry around extra paper chain of custody forms in case of errors. USDTL is excited to offer this feature at no extra cost to all our clients who wishes to take advantage of the service. If you are a current client, please reach out to your account manager for more information. If you'd like to set up an account with us, please email adultandchild@usdtl.com.
Subscribe to our channel to see more videos like this.